we'll look at answering an Elizabeth question 4. Now it's always going to be a find the links between two factors question. It's 10 marks and 10 minutes long and 3 paragraphs in length. You will be given 4 factors, but you only need to choose 2. And you must find as many connections between them as possible. Now these links could be causal, as in they cause each other, consequential, so they both are a consequence of something or cause the same consequence to happen. They affect the same people. The list goes on and on and on. And of course, you will need context. So here are your suggested paragraphs. So your first paragraph should introduce your 2 factors, prove that you know what they are, and give some context for the question. Your second paragraph is going to be your biggest one, where you explain at least 3 different ways that your factors connect. And then you're going to give a final conclusion, just a sentence or 2 about summing up the connections that you've come up with. It's absolutely crucial to making sure that the examiner has understood what you're trying to say. Explain the connections between 2 of the following that are to do with demands for changes to the religious settlement made by MPs. That's for 10 marks, and your factors are Walter Strickland, Peter Wentworth, Anthony Cope, and Sir Christopher Hatton. So we're going to box our command word. So explain the connections between 2. The key features are all those 4, but obviously you're only going to choose 2. And then you're going to glare at the hints, which is just the marks for a question 4. Again, always best to go with your gut when choosing this question. I was naturally drawn to Wentworth and Cope, so those are the 2 I'm going to go for, but there isn't a right answer. You can connect all of them together somehow. That's why they're given to you. So the first link I'm going to talk about is they criticise the way religion in England works. They're both MPs, so I can link in some of my extra knowledge about how Parliament works in Elizabethan England. And finally, I know that they're both imprisoned. So again, that is a link between the 2 men, rather than me having to link it to the religious settlement. You don't need to link it to the religious settlement, you just need to link those 2 factors to each other. And for my context, I'm going to be talking about things like the Puritan threat, the 1559 settlement, role of Parliament, loads of things like that.
MPs did attempt to make changes to the religious settlement, even though MPs did have limited freedom of speech and were not allowed to talk about matters of religion, marriage or succession. Peter Wentworth and Anthony Cope are connected to each other as they both fought for changes, were MPs in Parliament during the same time, and were imprisoned for their opinions. During this time, Parliament did not always meet on a regular basis and MPs had trouble with being able to pass laws as they did not have the ability to discuss several topics. Elizabeth wanted to be the supreme governor of the church, and feared losing power if MPs could discuss religion. Wentworth was thrown in jail because he criticised Elizabeth for not allowing MPs to discuss what they wanted to in Parliament. He said that MPs have no freedom of speech and cannot discuss the serious issue of religion. This later served as an example to Cope, who wanted to get rid of bishops and replace the Book of Common Prayer with John Calvin's book. Wentworth supported Cope, and both men were locked away by Christopher Hatton in the Tower of London for several months in 1587 for the comments they made and the support they gave each other. In this case, the earlier work by Peter Wentworth paved the way for Cope to also challenge Elizabeth by attempting to create changes to the religious settlement. Because both men were MPs, they worked alongside each other in an effort to obtain more freedom of speech in Parliament.
You will now see 3 practice questions, followed by 3 sample answers, and then your mark scheme. Explain the connections between two of the following that are to do with the causes of poverty. Enclosures, population growth, sheep farming, and rising prices. Explain the connections between two of the following which explain the popularity of Elizabeth I. Portraits, royal progresses, patronage, and the Queen's character. Explain the connections between two of the following that are to do with keeping order in England. Lord Lieutenant, Justice of the Peace, and Parish Constable, and the Overseer of the Poor.
Population growth and sheep farming are both connected to causes of poverty, as well as each other. One of Elizabeth's greatest challenges was fixing the issue of poverty, as the government did not have a system in place to help the poor, and relied on charity and the church to provide assistance. Both population growth and sheep farming link to poverty, as they each influenced inflation by putting a higher demand on goods, such as food and shelter. Vagrancy was a major issue as people could not afford food or a place to live caused by rack renting. In the countryside, many lost jobs on farms as laborers due to changes in farming, where sheep were kept rather than growing crops. With less demand for laborers in the countryside, many left in favor of more consistent employment in towns. However, this put a strain on the food market as less food was being harvested, prices went up and many people could no longer afford to eat. Much the same was population growth and its link to poverty, where people were living longer and again, this put a strain on the market. With more people living in towns, there was higher demand for all goods, such as housing, food and clothing. Landlords would charge high prices for rent, because the competition from buyers was high, there was always someone willing to pay more. Also, with more mouths to feed, prices for food increased. Population growth and sheep farming link to one another in the same way as mentioned above. Because less crops were being harvested in favor of herding sheep, there was less food which inflated prices. Add to this the fact that there was a rising population causing more competition for the limited goods, prices went up and the majority of the population had a difficult time making ends meet. Portraits and royal progresses are linked in many ways, including as a way to show her control, as a form of propaganda and a way of creating allies. When Elizabeth became queen after the death of her sister in 1558, England has experienced many monarchs in a short amount of time, leaving Elizabeth with a weak legacy she needed to strengthen. Elizabeth's portraits and progresses were choreographed to show her power. Her famous pelican portrait is so named for a bird that, in a time of crisis, will peck at its own skin to feed its young, which was meant to symbolize how Elizabeth would sacrifice herself for England. Similarly, by progressing round England she could use her clothing and makeup to prove her wealth and power to the people. They are also both very good forms of propaganda. She used her portraits to highlight key successes of her reign like the defeat of the Armada and could make a show of going to visit important people if there were any problems, like overseers of the poor. Finally, these factors link because they were used to make alliances and friendships. She could ensure she toured to, and stayed with, people she wanted to impress or honor to earn their favor. With portraits, they could be used as gifts to improve relations. To conclude, these two factors link as they were crucial in building up Elizabeth's reputation against the previous weak, short-lived monarchs. They were also used to encourage friendships and loyalty as well as being propaganda to get certain messages across. The overseer of the poor and the justices of the peace linked together in many ways, such as their pay, an increased role through Elizabeth's reign, and with the fact that more poor people meant more crime. Elizabeth used these forms of local government to run the justice system of England effectively, as she could not do all of these tasks herself. Justices of the peace looked after local law and order, and the overseers of the poor were in charge of collecting the poor tax and distributing it to the parish needy. These roles were both unpaid but came with a lot of status. They were normally undertaken by rich men who could afford to do the duties without compensation but also gain the benefit of having the power of the role. Furthermore, Both of these roles increased in importance in Elizabeth's era. Poverty increased massively, with 20 to 30% living on the edge of starvation, so the overseer became more important. Similarly, crime increased in this period too. A final link is along the lines of the previous point. This increase in poverty led to an increase in crime. As there was no government benefit system, those in poverty had to commit crimes to survive, which in turn leads to more JPs being needed to run the country. To conclude, these two factors link together because they have similar status and are both unpaid, as well as gaining in importance through Elizabeth's reign due to rising poverty and therefore crime.